Hello and welcome. We're pleased to have people joining from all over the world to take part in a conversation about treatment and research on cognitive challenges in MS, one of the most troubling symptoms that many people living with or affected by MS experience. My name is Angela White, and I am joining you from Washington, D.C. in the United States. I have been a volunteer with the National Multiple Sclerosis Society since my diagnosis of multiple sclerosis in 2002. As a volunteer and MS ambassador for the National MS Society, I advocate for needed change in public policy, serve as a committee member of the Black MS Experience Summit, and participate on the Community Review of MS Research Committee. I am also engaged in the MS International Federation's Patient-Reported Outcomes Initiative, representing the patient's perspective and helping to improve the effectiveness of MS research worldwide. Cognition in MS is an important topic, but it is also a very sensitive one. Most people with MS will experience some level of cognitive impairment. And if you have progressive MS as I do, the likelihood of having cognitive challenges is increased. We need strategies to be able to manage cognitive challenges in MS effectively, and there is an urgent need to find better solutions through research. In a moment, I will introduce you to our terrific panel of experts. But first, I'd like to recognize our webcast sponsor and share a bit of information about the International Progressive MS Alliance. We are grateful for the generous support of our sponsor, Sanofi. Thank you for helping to make this webcast possible. The International Progressive MS Alliance is an unprecedented global collaboration to end progressive MS. It includes 20 MS organizations, hundreds of researchers and health professionals, the pharmaceutical industry, and numerous companies, foundations, donors, and people affected by progressive MS. In short, the Alliance has brought the world together to solve progressive MS. To date, the Alliance has invested over 25 million euros in research with an overall commitment of 60 million euros through 2030. If you are watching this webcast, you likely know that ending progressive MS is an urgent and unmet need. With me today are leading experts who are working to help people with MS live better lives today and help fuel research to develop new life-changing solutions for tomorrow. Dr. Nancy Chevrolati is Director of Neuropsychology, Neuroscience, and Traumatic Brain Injury at the Kessler Foundation and Research Professor of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Rutgers University Medical School. She has published over 200 peer-reviewed manuscripts, including a book on changes in everyday life following brain injury and illness. She has done extensive research on cognition in MS and is considered an expert in cognitive rehabilitation in MS. Dr. Dawn Langdon is a professor of neuropsychology at Royal Holloway University of London. She is the neuropsychology lead on a number of multinational trials for the pharmaceutical industry. She has worked extensively on psychological aspects of MS, including measurement of cognition and its relation to pathology and other disease variables. Dr. Kathy Zakowski is the Associate Vice President for Research at the National MS Society in the U.S. She manages the Society's research portfolio on clinical and rehabilitation care. Prior to being at the Society, she was an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine as a researcher focused on neuroscience and as a clinician providing occupational therapy to individuals with multiple sclerosis. We'll start today's discussion on understanding some of the basics regarding cognition in MS. We will then discuss the assessment of cognitive impairment, lifestyle and rehabilitation strategies, and finally, research efforts to find new and better solutions. Dr. Chevrolati, I think it may be helpful to start with definitions. When we talk about cognitive function, what do we mean?
So, when we use the term cognitive functioning, what we are referring to is all of our thinking abilities. So, thinking through a problem, reasoning, problem solving. Cognitive functioning includes very basic things such as paying attention. So, when you're looking at a movie or listening to a conversation, simply attending to what you are trying to follow along with. But it also involves more complex things such as planning an event, planning a trip, or problem solving. And then one of the most widely recognized aspects of cognitive functioning is memory. So when we learn new information, and we do that every single day, we learn someone's name, we learn a phone number, learning that information, acquiring it, and then remembering it later. Those are all the most important aspects of cognitive functioning.
And so, as a follow up, Dr. Chevrolati, in MS, are there specific cognitive functions that are more likely to be affected?
There are. The most common cognitive deficit in persons with multiple sclerosis is slowed processing speed. The term processing speed refers to the ability to process and understand information quickly. So, in everyday life, this might come in the form of following along in a conversation,
Mm.
especially in an environment where you have a lot of distractors, such as a cocktail party. Or someone might have trouble following along when watching a fast paced movie. When information is coming in quickly, it's more difficult to process and understand that information. In addition, individuals with multiple sclerosis also often have difficulty with new learning and memory. So that would be taking in new information that you have to remember and then recalling it later when you need to use it. Individuals with MS may also have difficulty with problem solving or executive functioning. And when I use the term executive functioning, I mean those skills that make us uniquely human. So, planning, problem solving, mental flexibility, so switching from one thing to another efficiently. And then, finally, some patients also have some difficulty with language functions.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on language functions?
So traditionally, the identification of language functions has really followed processing speed. Researchers thought that the language functions, that difficulty that we were documenting, was really due to processing speed. But what we're discovering lately is there may actually be something unique about language functions that persons with MS are struggling with. So when we talk about language functioning, that the difficulty individuals with MS are having, that's really referring more to the ability to pull up the construct of the sentence and understand the sentence quickly and efficiently.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. I think this provides a good foundation for talking about treatment and research on cognition in MS. When someone believes they are experiencing some cognitive challenge or changes, the first step is often a cognitive evaluation by a healthcare professional. So, Dr. Langdon, you've extensive work in cognitive assessment in MS. Would you describe the assessment process? Tell us why assessment is so important for people with MS, and also include your involvement in the development and use of the assessment tool called BICAMS.
Certainly. Well, it is actually really important that people with MS do access a measure of their cognitive function, which is done in an objective and reliable way. Because if you feel down, if you feel tired, you may judge your cognition to be worse than it actually is. So it's important to have an objective ruler that gives you a good indication of exactly where your cognitive function is. With a group of other people, I have developed a measure of cognitive function called BICAMS, which stands for Brief International Cognitive Assessment for MS. And it takes just 15 minutes and it covers the three areas that are most commonly affected in MS, which we've heard Nancy tell us: processing speed, verbal memory, and visual memory. The international MS community, to its credit, has really got behind BICAMS, and there are now versions available in 26 countries. So there's a good chance that if you're watching this, that you may be able to access a BICAMS that's designed for you in your country.
Brilliant. Thank you. So let's move from assessment into the area of treatment. Dr. Langdon, you've been involved in several clinical trials for MS treatments. Do any of the existing disease-modifying therapies help with cognition in MS?
Well, there has been a study which pulled together all of the information we had about disease modifying drugs and cognition, which we call a systematic review. And in fact, there was an indication, there was good evidence that there is a small effect of many disease modifying drugs on cognition. But in fact, there isn't a lot of evidence about disease modifying drugs and cognition, and there's very little high quality evidence on disease modifying drugs in progressive MS. So it's probably fair to say that at the moment we're waiting to feel very confident that the DMDs will help with cognition in secondary progressive, although the relapsing remitting evidence suggests that it would.
So are there other pharmacological interventions that can help with cognition in MS?
Well, sadly, the evidence for the so-called symptomatic drugs, so we'd be thinking of things like donepezil, ginseng, and so on, the evidence for their efficacy against cognition in MS is actually very limited. And so at the moment, the best evidence we've got is that by tackling the primary progressive underlying pathology is our best strategy for slowing down the accumulation of cognitive impairment.
Thank you. So I think another area that we want to understand is how other MS symptoms like fatigue or depression affect cognition, and conversely, perhaps, how cognition may affect other symptoms. Dr. Chevrolati, can you address this?
Sure. I think it's important to remember that our bodies are essentially one large system with individual systems functioning within it. So, what that means is everything we experience impacts everything else. So, if we're depressed, we may feel sluggish. We may have trouble focusing on things or remembering things. And the relationship works in reverse as well. Cognitive problems may lead to depression. Fatigue, which is a very common symptom in multiple sclerosis, certainly plays a large role. Fatigue and cognitive problems commonly co-occur, and then depression plays a role as well. So when we're treating one symptom, the others also have to be monitored, and it's important to treat all of these symptoms that come with multiple sclerosis as interacting with one another and acknowledging and documenting the effect that they actually have on one another.
So what do we know about lifestyle factors that people can adopt to improve cognitive health? I'm thinking about things like diet and fitness and exercise, socialization. Dr. Zakowski, can you explain those approaches that benefit people? And if they do benefit, how?
Yes, definitely. I think they're really important to consider in this conversation. So, lifestyle factors like diet and exercise and socialization can impact the risk of getting MS, can affect how the disease progresses, which ultimately then affects cognition. And essentially, as Nancy just pointed out, multiple aspects of a person's life or symptoms. So if I were to kind of describe them individually, diet, we know if you maintain a healthy body weight, that is associated with decreased risk of MS-related disability. We know diet has a strong relationship to body weight and the development of cardiovascular risk factors and like high blood pressure and diabetes. Diet also affects the composition of the gut microbiome, that bacteria that lives in our gut, which in turn has important effects on the immune system that seem to be relevant to MS. And dietary metabolites like vitamins and fatty acids and amino acids that form proteins, they all have a direct effect on the immune system and the brain, and essentially affecting then symptoms like cognition. Unfortunately, we don't know that there's a specific diet that will help with MS, but any positive changes you make are likely to help your overall health and well-being. And so experts generally agree that a healthy diet is important to the long-term health of your nervous system. If I move to exercise, we know that there is convincing evidence that exercise and physical activity can improve things like circulation. It brings oxygen to the brain. It can do more specific things like improve walking and balance and fatigue, as well as memory and depression and areas of cognition. So there's a lot to gain by exercising and more to lose by being sedentary. And it's recommended that people with MS should participate in 150 minutes per week or more of exercise. And before everyone stops me and says that's impossible, the idea is that you can add this throughout your week. So 10 minutes of doing some exercise in the morning on Monday, you keep adding that throughout the week. And you'd be surprised, you really can add up to 150 pretty easily if you're consistently really working towards trying to do exercise throughout the week. And lastly, and I think we do perhaps sort of underestimate the impact of socialization. So we're learning that engaging in activities that bring you comfort, fun, and meaning also have a lot of benefits for people with MS. These can be like a sport, a hobby, volunteer work, or just enjoying a cup of tea with someone. So making choices to live a full life and participating with others is really, really important. And one area of this that I wanted to bring up is resilience. And this is that ability to kind of bounce back from difficult circumstances. And I think many people with progressive MS would say their MS has provided some difficult circumstances. So resilience isn't really just about being happy and ignoring real difficulties. It's really involving something called positive adaptation or realistic optimism. So the idea is to remain hopeful about the future while making plans that enable you to cope with your actual reality. And this, requires hope and courage. And this is often really helped or facilitated by talking with others or engaging socially with people that you enjoy being with. So really all three areas are things you can do right now that are these lifestyle choices. There is less scientific evidence about all of them than perhaps a DMT or a medication, but still very, very important and something you could do right now to affect your cognition.
I think what I really like about what you just said and what Dr. Shefarlati said before was you're both talking about systems and how it all works together and how you can't just isolate and say, work on this area and that's sufficient, but it has to work holistically and in an integrative manner throughout. So thank you. Dr. Shefarlati, you're a leading expert in cognitive rehabilitation in MS. Can you describe some of the approaches that have demonstrated effectiveness on cognition in MS, including your work using what is called the modified story memory technique?
Of course. So we have done several literature reviews here at Kessler Foundation where we've critically examined the cognitive rehabilitation literature for what has sufficient evidence that we can say it works and what does not yet have sufficient evidence. Obviously, as we've mentioned, one of the biggest problems that patients with multiple sclerosis experience is slowed processing speed. Processing speed deficits have been shown to be responsive to a few treatment protocols available, Reacom is one that is available in 17 languages and very widely researched in Europe, and that's showing some impact on processing speed abilities.
Dr. Shivalati, I'm sorry, can you explain what that is?
So Reacom is a treatment that's computer-based, and it is done with the aid of a therapist. And what you're essentially doing is going through different exercises that challenge your processing speed and ask you to process information quickly, match items quickly, and do different tasks that challenge you to do things faster than you had done it previously. And that has been shown to have some impact on processing speed abilities in multiple sclerosis. The second program that is similar in its approach, in that it's asking you to do tasks quickly and more efficiently over time, is Brain HQ. And that's another program that is showing some evidence in the literature to be able to help individuals with multiple sclerosis improve in regard to their processing speed. Another area that's fairly well researched, or more and more research is accumulating, is in regard to treating learning and memory abilities. As Dawn indicated earlier, verbal and visual spatial new learning and memory are challenging for someone who has for many people who have multiple sclerosis. Strategy training is really showing great promise in this regard. So when I use the word strategy training involves learning new ways to learn and remember information. So a good example of strategy training is the Kessler Foundation story memory technique, which we developed at Kessler Foundation. This technique teaches people two strategies to help them learn and remember new information. It teaches them how to use imagery and how to use context. So by imagery, I mean taking verbal information and attaching it to a visual image. And by doing that, our research has shown that you're actually engaging additional brain regions in learning that information. And by context, I mean taking different ideas and applying them to a context that's meaningful to you. So in the story memory technique, we use stories, and we teach people how to put different information together into one story so that they can then later use their visual imagery techniques that they're learning within the treatment to visualize that story. And by doing those two things, they're engaging different brain regions to help them learn and remember new information. So our research has shown some very nice improvements in learning and memory from the story memory technique. And we've shown those improvements both in a lab environment, and people are reporting improvements in their everyday life following the completion of treatment, which is what we're really worried about, how people are functioning in their everyday life, because that's what matters. And then we've also demonstrated changes in the way in which the brain is actually going about learning and remembering this new information and the engagement of these additional brain regions. And that is very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited by this. So the International Progressive MS Alliance has launched a new research initiative to help find new solutions to some of the most challenging symptoms of MS. Not only to find effective solutions for cognitive challenges, but also for fatigue, pain, and mobility. Can you tell us more about this initiative, Dr. Zakowski?
Yes, definitely. So we know that the impact of these symptoms that you mentioned, fatigue, cognitive impairment, pain, and weakness, are really far-reaching and can include, things like job loss, stress to family, financial strain. And yet current disease-modifying therapies really offer limited benefit in progressive MS specifically. And so rehabilitation, the kind that Dr. Shivalati just described, is really the primary treatment available to address symptoms and to treat disability and improve well-being for people with progressive MS. There are very few established rehabilitation studies that focus on people with progressive MS. And so in response to that, the Alliance has envisioned the need for a pipeline of research for improving the evaluation and implementation of symptomatic treatment and rehabilitation to improve well-being for people with progressive MS. And by a pipeline, I mean, we just started this spring with the first stage. It's called Innovation and Planning. And these These awards will demonstrate a strong expert team that offers the potential for novel therapeutic interventions or outcomes specific for progressive MS and specific to one of those 4 symptoms we described. And so the start date for those funded awards will be January of 2024. Then the second stage, about a year later, we will evaluate what we're calling full efficacy awards. And this is in the pipeline, we'll focus on clinical trials that support the testing of specific intervention strategies or outcome measures, and projects that begin looking at how to implement that. And that will take several years to test these strategies. But then what we find is there's kind of a gap then. So there's studies that have evaluated interventions, but then they don't actually get to people. So the last stage of this pipeline is to actually focus on that piece, focus on the implementation of what was learned from the efficacy or the clinical trial awards, and put that into clinical practice. And even trying to include, getting this into clinical practice, not just locally, but more widely.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you. Well, we're nearing the end of our time together, and I've learned so much. I take notes on everything that I hear. And so I'm like, I'm going to follow up on this. I'm going to follow up on this. So I hope everyone else is doing the same, particularly now that I want to ask each of you to provide some parting advice to our viewers. What is one thing that someone with MS, particularly progressive MS, could do today if they are experiencing cognitive challenges? Let's start with you, Dr. Langdon. Any advice you care to share?
Well, Angela, I'm going to cheat and say 2 things, if that's all right.
That's fine.
The first thing I'm going to say is don't panic. Okay, there's loads of things that you can do. There's loads of ways that you can interact with those around you at work, your family, your healthcare professionals, which can go some way to overcoming these difficulties that you're experiencing. So that's my first thing. And my second thing is get smart. Find out as much as you can about what you can do to understand and manage and slow down your cognitive difficulties, and share that with your family, your health professionals, those you work with, those that love you. And there is quite a lot of information available from MS societies. Unfortunately, inevitably, I apologize for this, most of it's in English. I'm sorry about that. But it is available. And if you have someone who can translate for you, or if you can ask your local MS society to translate, I think they're the 2 things that I think are most important about managing this as well as you can and having the best life you can in the context of cognitive difficulties.
Thank you. So don't panic, and then delve into what you can find out about it and how to slow it down. Thank you. Dr. Chevrolati, what is something you would advise people to help manage cognitive challenges?
So I would suggest that people who are having cognitive challenges do one thing at a time. In our society, we are constantly pushing ourselves to multitask, to be more productive, but we are simply not as efficient when we multitask. And that's true for everyone. It's true for people with and without cognitive difficulties. So multitasking is especially challenging when you are dealing with a cognitive impairment. So I always advise people to focus on one thing at a time and let the less important things wait. And that will invariably improve your ability to function effectively, particularly in the presence of cognitive impairment.
Oh, I like that. And I think that goes back to what Dr. Langdon just said in terms of making sure you're wrapping in your healthcare, your family, your friends, your colleagues, because you have to explain to people, no, I don't multitask. And no, you can't ask me as I'm preparing food how to, to think about something else, because I can't answer you. I can't do this. And then I get overwhelmed. So thank you for that. Dr. Zakowski, what advice would you highlight?
I think mine goes very well with what's already been said, but maybe a little bit different in that I would really recommend that you stay aware of all the things you can do, even with limited resources, and that you don't have to do all of it as Nancy just said, one thing at a time. So maybe try to be aware of your diet and, change one part of it so that you're eating a little bit more healthy. In terms of, same thing for physical activity. Don't try to do everything because you're just going to exhaust yourself. Try to add one thing and see how that goes. And in terms of social engagement, be aware of the importance of the social engagement. So try to be sure that you're getting some socialization every day.
So, and if I remember correctly, you said part of that is joy. So finding the things that bring you joy.
Yeah.
Okay. So if everyone can find a thing to bring them joy every day, and then do it one thing at a time, and then find out what they can do and not panic, we're gonna be better at this. We're gonna have this cognitive function thing worked out. So thank you so much. Today we have addressed some of the key questions regarding treatment and research in cognition in MS, and we recognize this is a large and very complex topic. We've only briefly touched on some of the important areas regarding cognitive challenges in progressive MS. At the very end of this webcast, you will note a listing of online resources where you can find further information on MS research and strategies to manage this extremely challenging symptom. I'm going to add my own piece of advice here and slow down. I have to remind myself of that sometimes. You may want to take a screenshot of these resources at the end, so make sure you have that ability to do so and take note. As I hope you've seen with today's panelists, the Alliance is working to bring together the very best people in the world to find solutions to the challenges that people living with and affected by progressive MS face. The Alliance continues to inspire hope and to make progress through funding research that can improve people's lives. And still, we must and will do more to end progressive MS. Thank you to our panel of experts, Dr. Chevalati, Dr. Langdon, and Dr. Zakowski. And thanks to all of you who are watching for joining us today. Please stay connected to the Alliance through our regular webcast and your local MS organization. And please share the work of the Alliance with others. We need everyone to be a part of this effort. Together, we are stronger than progressive MS.